The wind was a killer that morning. It coiled around the lonely cabin like a hangman's rope, pulling tight, trying to choke the last bit of life from the rattling window panes. Frost had crawled across the glass, thick and white like a funeral shroud. Eloise Thatcher stood on the porch, barefoot. The wood was so cold it felt like standing on a bed of nails. She was wrapped in a thin shawl that had belonged to her mother, a relic from another life, a life with warmth, a life with rain that kissed the windows instead of trying to break them down. She stared out at the trail, or where the trail used to be. Now it was just a faint line disappearing into a wall of gray, pine-choked wilderness. Her breath puffed out in small, panicked clouds. Beau had ridden off 2 days ago. He said he was going to fetch firewood. That was the story, anyway. He'd packed his saddlebags with jerky and coffee, enough for a week. He'd left her with half a jar of beans. Not even a full jar. Half. "Don't burn through the rest of the kindling," he'd muttered, his eyes cold and flat. "Learn to ration, Eloise. It's what women were built for." Then he'd snapped the reins and disappeared into the trees, leaving her in a cloud of dust and silence, a silence that was heavier than any stone. 2 days. The hearth was cold now. The pot-bellied stove in the corner was a black iron tomb. Its belly was empty, its mouth hung open, yawning for a meal it would never get. She'd burned the last chair leg yesterday. The flames had licked at the carved wood, a pretty pattern her own grandfather had whittled, and turned it into ash. It had given her maybe an hour of warmth. Today, she was looking at the ladder to the loft. Her fingers were raw. They were split and bleeding from the cold and the work. Her lips were cracked. The silence in the cabin was a living thing. It was a predator, carving away at her sanity, piece by piece. She was a schoolteacher once, in a small town in Alabama where the world was soft and green. Children brought her wildflowers. Beau had come through town with a clean shirt and even cleaner promises. He spoke of land, of building something true and honest with his own 2 hands. "You'll be mistress of your own place," he'd whispered, his breath warm against her ear. No small-town gossips, just sky and room to breathe. He had a way of saying things that made you believe. He'd painted a picture of a life so beautiful, she'd packed up her own without a second thought. She'd left the wildflowers and the warm rain behind. He hadn't mentioned that the nearest neighbor was a drunk who lived 6 miles south. He hadn't mentioned that the ground was a stubborn, rocky mess that barely grew potatoes. He hadn't mentioned the leaking roof, or the way his temper could flare hotter and faster than a summer thunderstorm. The kindness hadn't vanished overnight. It had frayed. Like a rope rubbed raw over sharp rock, it wore away, thread by thread. First went the laughter, then the talk, then came the slaps, then came the silence. The long, terrifying silence that was worse than any blow. She tried to hold on to hope. She tried to believe he was just delayed, that he'd ride over that ridge any minute with a load of firewood, maybe some bread from town, maybe even that smile he'd given her the day he lifted her onto the wagon and said, "We'll start fresh, Eloise." But a different kind of knowledge had settled deep in her bones. A cold, heavy certainty. Beau wasn't coming back. He hadn't gone for firewood. He had packed his jerky and his coffee and he had left. He'd left her in a cabin with no food and no heat in the dead of winter, 60 miles from the nearest town. He hadn't just left her. He had left her to die. And there was one more thing. Her dog, Wicket. A little terrier mix with a bark bigger than his body. He'd gone quiet 2 nights ago. Just before Beau left. She'd called for him. She'd whistled until her lips were numb. Nothing. Now a new, terrible thought began to creep in. She pushed it away, but it kept coming back. She had to check the barn. The barn was 100 feet from the cabin. The walk felt like a mile. The wind tore at her shawl, whipping it around her face. Every step on the frozen ground sent a jolt of pain up through her legs. The barn door was slightly ajar, creaking back and forth on a single rusted hinge, a sound like a tired old man groaning in his sleep. She pushed it open. The air inside was still and colder than the grave. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light coming from a crack in the roof. The smell of old hay and manure was thick in the air. And something else. Something sweet and rotten. She saw him curled up near the haystack. Wicket. He looked like he was just sleeping. His little body was a tight, perfect circle, as if he was trying to stay warm. But he wasn't sleeping. His fur was stiff with frost. His eyes were open, but they were dull, glassy. He wasn't breathing. She knelt beside him, her whole body shaking. She laid a hand on his side. It was as hard and cold as a rock. "Oh, Wicket," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You waited for him too, didn't you?" But as she looked closer, she saw it. Something dark matted the fur around his neck. Not mud. It was dried. And around him, the hay wasn't just disturbed. It was pressed down. And there was a single clear boot print in the dirt right beside him. A man's boot print. Beau's boot print. It wasn't the cold that killed Wicket. The dog had loved Beau. He would have barked and yapped and run in circles the second Beau came near the barn. He would have been a nuisance. A loud, happy nuisance. Unless Beau didn't want any noise. Unless Beau wanted to leave quietly, without a barking dog announcing his departure to the woman he was leaving to freeze. The nausea rose in her throat, hot and acidic. The half a jar of beans, the empty woodpile, the dead dog. It wasn't neglect. It wasn't a man just running away from his responsibilities. It was a plan. It was a cold, calculated execution. Her execution. She couldn't leave Wicket there. She couldn't. She found an old wooden spoon near the horse stall, the one she used to measure out oats. The ground was frozen solid. A shovel would have been useless, but the spoon was small and sharp. She dug, for hours. Her palms blistered and split open, the pain a distant throbbing drumbeat. The cold bit through her thin dress, but she didn't stop. With every spoonful of frozen dirt, she repeated the words in her head. He planned this. He wanted me to die. She finally carved out a shallow hole, just big enough. She wrapped Wicket in a piece of an old grain sack and laid him gently inside. She covered him back up, patting the earth down with her raw hands. When she was done, she stood up, swaying on her feet. The world was a blur of gray and white. No one was coming. Not for her, not out here. Beau had made sure of that. He'd brought her to a place so remote, so forgotten, that a person could simply disappear without a trace. She stumbled back to the cabin. The ladder was still there, waiting. It would burn. It would give her another few hours. But what about after that? The table? Her own bed frame? How long could she trade her home for a few more hours of misery? By late afternoon, the sky began to darken. Not with clouds, but with the thick, oppressive weight of coming night. She sat on the porch in the one remaining chair, Wicket's empty collar clutched in her hand. The leather was cold against her skin. Her body had started to ache in a deep, internal way. A dull throb behind her eyes. A slow, grinding fatigue in her joints. Hunger wasn't a sharp pain anymore. It was just a hollow emptiness, a constant companion. She remembered her mother, humming old hymns in the kitchen when the days felt too long. She tried to hum one now, but the sound caught in her throat, a dry, rasping croak. The oil lamp inside sputtered and died. No more wick, no more oil, only the dark. She curled up on the floor beside the cold stove, pulling her skirts tight around her legs. She was too cold to sleep, but her body was shutting down anyway. Her heart beat a slow, heavy rhythm in her chest. "I won't die for you, Beau. I won't." But the words tasted like a lie. She must have drifted off at some point, into that strange half-sleep where you're aware of everything and nothing all at once. She dreamt of warmth. She dreamt of her mother's hands, of soup, of being safe. Then the dream changed. A sound, not the wind, not a coyote howling at the moon, something closer. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, crunching in the snow just beyond the tree line. Her eyes snapped open, The cabin was pitch black. Her heart wasn't beating slowly anymore. It was a panicked bird, slamming against the cage of her ribs. She tried to stand, but her legs were numb, useless things. She crawled across the floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She pulled herself up to the window, peering through the frosted glass. Nothing. Just the endless, empty dark. But the feeling didn't go away. The feeling of being watched. "Bo?" she whispered, the name a curse on her lips. Silence, then a new sound, a branch snapping. Right behind the cabin, close. Too close. She saw a shape move past the barn. It was tall, too tall for a wolf. It moved with a slow, silent grace that wasn't human. Not the way she knew humans to move. It wasn't Bo. Bo was loud. Bo stumbled. This thing flowed through the darkness like water. She scrambled away from the window, her mind screaming. She crawled back to the hearth, her hand closing around the cold, heavy iron poker. Her only weapon. If it was Bo, he'd be angry. He'd come back to finish the job. If it was a stranger, maybe she could bargain, though she had nothing left to trade. If it was death itself, come to claim her, she just hoped it would be quick. She pressed her back against the cold stone of the fireplace, holding the poker out in front of her with trembling hands. She waited. Every nerve in her body was on fire. The silence stretched, it thickened, it became suffocating. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. She lost all track of time, and then she saw it. A light. Outside, not a fire. A soft, steady glow moving through the trees. A lantern. It was moving towards the cabin. She had a choice. Stay here, hidden in the dark, and wait for whatever was out there to break down the door. Or go to the light. She didn't know why, but she chose the light. She crawled to the door, her body screaming in protest. She pulled herself up, her hand shaking so badly she could barely lift the latch. The cold air hit her like a physical blow. It roared into the cabin, stealing what little warmth was left in her body. She stepped out onto the porch. The snow was deep, biting at her bare feet. The world was a dizzying panorama of stars, more stars than she had ever seen. And there, at the edge of the tree line, she saw him. A man, tall and still, wrapped in deerskin, his face half hidden in shadow, the other half lit by the soft glow of the lantern in his hand. He didn't move. He didn't wave. He just stood there, watching her. And in that moment, a strange, impossible feeling washed over her. The terror that had been strangling her for days didn't disappear, but something else rose up to meet it. Something that felt like an answer. She didn't know his name. She didn't know if he was there to help her or to hurt her. But she knew one thing with the certainty of iron in her gut. He wasn't Bo, and Bo was never, ever coming back. The storm had passed, but its teeth were still buried in the land. The snow was a crust of dried salt over the prairie, so brittle it shattered under the weight of a horse's hoof. The trees stood like an army of ghosts, their branches heavy with ice and silence. His name was Talon. He rode without hurry, his horse a gray shadow moving against the pale hills. He wasn't hunting game, not today. The morning had carried the scent of wrongness on the wind. It was a silence that was too deep, too absolute. The animals, the deer and the rabbits and the foxes, had all fled westward in the night. They were running from something they couldn't see, but could feel in their bones. Talon trusted that instinct more than he trusted his own eyes. The land spoke a language older than words, and he had learned how to listen. He swung off his horse near a broken fence line at the edge of a shallow canyon. His moccasins made no sound on the frozen ground. That's when he saw it, a small smear of blood in the snow. Old, mostly black, near the fence post, and beside it, paw prints. A small dog by the look of them. The prints led from the direction of the cabin, circled the post twice, and then they just stopped, as if the animal had simply laid down and given up. But Talon saw something else. He crouched, his gloved fingers brushing the snow aside. Underneath the fresh powder were other marks, the faint impression of a man's boot. And something had been dragged, something small. His eyes narrowed. He looked closer. He saw another set of tracks. Fainter. A woman's boots, worn down at the heel. Uneven, dragging steps. They led away from the fence, back toward the skeletal shape of a cabin and a slumped barn on the rise. He stood up slowly. His breath hung in the air, a perfect, unmoving cloud. He didn't speak. Words were for warm places. The cold demanded silence. He found her half a mile later. She was curled up on the porch of the cabin, a collapsed thing of frozen skirts and raw purple knuckles. The roof of the cabin sagged like a broken wing. The whole place looked forgotten, not just by man, but by God himself. Her eyes were barely open. Her breath was a shallow, desperate whisper of steam. He approached her the way you approach a wounded wolf, slowly, silently, making it clear you are not a threat. He knelt beside her. He saw the faint glint of a gold ring on her finger, dull with grime and cold. Her lips moved, a faint, dry crackle, but no sound came out. He pressed the back of his bare fingers to her cheek. It was like touching ice. She flinched, a tiny, spasmodic jerk. A single hoarse whisper escaped her lips. "Don't bury me! In his name!" Talon blinked once. It wasn't a plea for help. It wasn't a prayer. It was a command, a final act of defiance. In that moment, he made a decision. He moved with a speed and decisiveness that was startling. He shed his own heavy coat, the one lined with thick buffalo fur, and wrapped it around her fragile body. He lifted her. She weighed almost nothing. A bundle of sticks and bones. A woman shouldn't weigh so little. His horse stood steady, trained for this, for silence and patience. He laid her across the saddle, securing her with one strong arm, her head resting against his shoulder. Her faint breath ghosted against his collarbone. He didn't ride toward his own camp. He didn't ride toward the town, 60 miles south. He took her along the ridge toward a hollow tucked between two massive stone sentinels, a place he knew, a place where the wind couldn't reach, and a small creek still trickled, warm from the earth, even under a blanket of snow. He built a fire, quick and efficient. He coaxed a flame from dry tinder and flint, a skill passed down through generations. He built her a small lean-to from pine boughs and his second blanket, a shelter against the biting cold. He had a small tin of broth in his saddlebag. He warmed it over the fire and fed it to her, drop by precious drop, tipping the rim of the cup to her cracked lips. She swallowed just enough to keep the spark of life from being extinguished completely. He didn't ask her name. Names didn't matter yet. Survival was the only word in their vocabulary. She stirred later, in the flickering firelight. She murmured things he couldn't understand. Names of children, maybe. Whispers of regret. Her worn-out boots steamed by the fire, thawing slowly. Her face was still ghost-pale, but the terrifying blue tinge was gone from her lips. Talon kept watch all night. He didn't sleep. He didn't even blink. He just sat by the fire, a silent guardian, and waited. In the deep, quiet hours of the dark, his own ghosts came to visit. He heard his mother's voice, soft but stern, a memory from a lifetime ago. "Some women don't cry, Talon," she had told him. "They burn from the inside out. That's how you know they're truly dying." He'd seen it before, years ago. A white woman on the trade road, left to die by her husband. Her baby was already gone, clutched in her arms. He had buried them both, scratching her name into a flat stone with the tip of his knife. It was all he could do. This one wasn't dead yet. And it wasn't because someone had helped her. It was because she had refused to die. There was a difference, a powerful one. By morning, she could sit up. She was weak, her movements shaky, but she was awake. She looked at him with eyes that were clear and sharp. She looked at him as if he was a phantom, part dream, part nightmare, part miracle. "Are you from the town?" she asked, her voice a dry rasp. He shook his head. "No town wants me." A flicker of confusion crossed her face. She studied him, trying to place him in her world. Not a savior, not a neighbor. Something else entirely. An outsider, just like her. "Why did you stop?" she whispered. He looked out toward the woods, toward the silent, snow-covered trees. The ground was speaking, he said simply. She didn't understand. Not fully, but she didn't ask any more questions. She understood that some answers weren't meant for words. They stayed in that hidden hollow for 2 days. The fire burned slow and steady. He hunted while she slept, bringing back a squirrel that he roasted over the coals. She ate, her hands still trembling, but she ate. On the second night, the silence between them changed. It was no longer a void, but a shared space. She sat beside him by the fire, wrapped in his blanket, not touching but close enough for him to hear the slow, steady rhythm of her heart. She stared up at the stars, as if seeing them for the first time. I used to think coming west was like being reborn, she whispered to the darkness. A place where no one knew what you were before. Talon said nothing. He just listened. I think he knew that too, she added, her voice barely audible. He brought me out here because no one would come looking. Still, Talon remained silent. His silence wasn't cold or empty. It was vast and accepting. It was a space where she could place her pain without fear of judgment. She finally turned to look at him, his face carved from shadow and firelight. You didn't ask me what happened. I saw enough, he said, his voice a low rumble. You don't know my name. He turned his gaze toward the fire. Names are for those who stay. Something in his words, in their quiet finality, seemed to loosen a knot inside her chest. A tear, the first one she had shed in months, traced a clean path through the grime on her cheek. She wasn't undone. She was just beginning. That night, she dreamed of warmth, and for the first time when she woke up, the warmth was still there. On the third morning, she stood on her own. She was shaky, but she was upright. She looked north, toward the ridge where her cabin, her prison, was hidden. I can't stay in that place, she said. He nodded. He understood. But I want to see it, she said, her voice stronger now. One last time. He didn't argue. He simply offered her his hand. His palm was rough, calloused, but warm. She took it. Her fingers were frail and cold in his, but she held on tight. They rode slowly through the thawing woods. The snow still clung to the world in stubborn patches, but underneath, the earth was breathing again. Life was returning. As they cleared the final ridge, the cabin came into view. Her heart stuttered. It looked so much smaller now. Pathetic. Just 4 crooked walls and a roof that sagged with the weight of shame and neglect. She dismounted and walked up the steps. The door creaked open under her touch. The air inside was stale and dead. The last chair she hadn't burned was still there. The stove was a cold, black maw, but her mother's shawl still hung on the peg by the door. She took it down, her fingers tracing the familiar worn pattern. She folded it carefully, reverently. Talon waited outside, giving her the space she needed. She stepped back out onto the porch, her face a mask. There was no grief in her eyes. Not yet. There was no forgiveness either. There was something older, harder, a quiet reclaiming. I think I'll take it back, she said, her voice clear and steady. He looked at her, a question in his eyes. The cabin? No, she said. She looked him straight in the eye. My name. And for the first time she spoke it aloud to him, a word she hadn't truly owned in years. Eloise. He nodded once, a gesture of profound acknowledgement. She waited, expecting him to offer his in return. He hesitated for a long moment, then answered, his voice low. Talon. She repeated it softly, testing the feel of it on her tongue. Talon. They stood there for a long time as the wind curled around them, no longer a killer, but a messenger of change. No one had spoken of salvation. No one had offered any promises. But something like it had already begun. The chimney on the crooked little cabin started smoking again. It wasn't a great billowing plume of smoke, just a thin, steady ribbon of gray rising into the pale winter sky. But it was enough. It was a signal. It was a statement. Someone was alive in there, Talon had stayed. He didn't move into the cabin. He slept in the barn, on a rough cot he'd built himself from split timber and an old horse blanket. He was a silent presence, a guardian shadow moving at the edges of her world. Eloise found a new rhythm. The days were no longer about survival. They were about reclamation. She moved through the small space with purpose, no longer a ghost haunting the rooms. She scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed. She washed the linens in water she hauled from the creek and thawed over the fire. She fixed the broken latch on the door. The sounds of the cabin changed. The desperate scrape of a chair leg being broken for firewood was replaced by the steady thump of an axe splitting kindling. The silence of starvation was replaced by the gentle bubble of soup in a pot. She was rebuilding her life, one small, deliberate act at a time. At night, she would read from an old book of poetry, the pages thin and brittle. Talon never asked her to read aloud, but she knew he was listening. Sometimes, she would catch a glimpse of him through the window, sitting on the porch steps, sharpening his knife by the faint glow of her lantern. He wasn't watching the darkness. He was watching her reflection in the glass. When their eyes met, he wouldn't look away. He would just give a slight, almost imperceptible nod. A nod that said, "You are still here. That is enough." They spoke little, but their silences were no longer empty. They were filled with a quiet understanding that ran deeper than words. One evening, he placed a freshly skinned rabbit on the chopping block outside the door. "You know how to cook this?" he asked. It was the first direct question he'd asked her about her past life. Eloise blinked, surprised. A memory flickered, a warm kitchen, the smell of rosemary and thyme, her mother guiding her hands. "I can learn again," she said. He didn't smile, but she saw the tension in his shoulders relax just a little. She made a stew, adding the last of her dried herbs from a tin on the back shelf. The flavors were a ghost on her tongue, a memory of a woman she had almost forgotten. Sage, salt, the sharp bite of pepper. When she handed him a bowl, he took it with a quiet, "Thank you." His voice was like stone warmed by the sun. They ate at the small, scarred table, the wind rattling the window panes outside. But inside, the cabin was steady. It was warm. It was safe. Later, she stood on the porch while he mended a piece of rope for the horse's bridle. The golden light from the lantern cast long shadows, painting him as a figure of myth. She watched the way his hands moved, the steady, efficient precision in every motion. There was a gravity to him. He didn't just fill space, he changed it. "Were you always alone?" she asked suddenly, the question surprising even herself. He looked up from his work, his dark eyes meeting hers across the small space. "Not always." A pause. "My brother died," he said simply. No more explanation. None was needed. Eloise nodded. She understood that some griefs were too heavy for words. "My husband, Beau, he never liked silence," she found herself saying, the words spilling out into the quiet night. "He said it made a woman start thinking." Talon went back to his work, pulling the twine tight. Maybe that's why he feared it. A small, bitter smile touched Eloise's lips. "He said I talked too much." Talon's hands stilled. He looked directly at her, his gaze unwavering. "Then talk now." She didn't. Not then. But the offer, the simple, profound invitation, wrapped around her like a warm blanket. It was a permission she hadn't realized she was starving for. It took 3 weeks for the town to notice the smoke. Martha Copley, a woman whose face was permanently pinched from a diet of gossip and judgment, was the first to mention it. She ran the dry goods store, a place that traded in whispers as much as it did in flour and sugar. "It's a Comanche," she said to the preacher's wife, her voice a low hiss that slipped between the bolts of calico fabric. "Living up there with her, that Thatcher woman. Shameless." The story grew legs. It ran through the town like a fever, mutating with every telling. Eloise Thatcher, the poor widow, had gone wild. She'd taken a savage for a lover, betrayed the memory of her dead husband. One man, A drunkard named Jeb swore he'd seen her with his own eyes, hauling firewood in a man's coat, her hair all loose and wild. Another claimed she was already carrying the man's child. None of it was true. But in a town like this, truth was a flimsy currency. A week later, Eloise walked into that town, alone. She needed flour, salt, and thread. She wore a simple gray dress and her best bonnet, her spine as straight as a rifle barrel. The moment she pushed open the door to the dry goods store, a hush fell over the room. The air chilled. Every eye was on her. Martha Copley stood behind the counter, a sickly sweet smile plastered on her face. It was a smile that didn't come anywhere near her cold, dead eyes. "Well, well," Martha said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Eloise, dear, we weren't sure if you were still among the living." "I am," Eloise said, her voice calm and even. She placed her list on the counter. "And I'm baking bread again." Behind her, another woman snickered. "Not the only thing she's warming up in that cabin, I hear." Eloise didn't turn. She didn't flinch. She kept her eyes fixed on Martha Copley, her gaze so steady, so unwavering, that the store owner was the first to look away. She paid for her goods in silence, the coins clinking loudly in the quiet room. She hoisted the sack of flour onto her shoulder and walked out. The church bell began to toll as she passed, calling the faithful to prayer. She paused and looked up at the steeple. A flock of doves sat perched on the cross, preening in the afternoon sun. She smiled. At least they knew how to stay above the noise. When she got back to the cabin, Talon was fixing a loose board on the porch. He didn't ask how it went. He didn't have to. The answer was written on her face. She handed him the spool of thread he'd asked for. "They'll talk more now," she said. He looped the thread through a cracked leather strap he was mending. "They talked before," he said, not looking up. "Just softer." That night, for the first time since the frost came, she brushed out her hair. It was a tangled, matted mess. She worked through the knots slowly, patiently, her fingers gentle. As the strands fell smooth and dark against her back, she felt something unfurl in her chest, a knot in her own soul, loosening. Later, Talon came to the porch while she was sweeping. He was holding a piece of pine, freshly carved and sanded smooth. It was a new leg for the chair she had burned. "For the chair," she said, a statement, not a question. He nodded. "Figure we build one thing back each day." They didn't touch, but when she took the piece of wood from his hand, their fingers brushed. A spark of warmth, fleeting but real. Neither of them pulled away. The next morning brought a sharp frost. The air was clean and cold. A hawk circled high overhead, a dark speck against a brilliant blue sky. Eloise was walking the fence line, a basket on her arm, checking for breaks. Talon walked a few paces behind her, his hammer ringing out in a steady, rhythmic beat as he secured a loose rail. Halfway along the fence, she stopped and turned to him. The sun caught in her hair, turning it to fire. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said. He stopped his work, raising an eyebrow. "Of what?" "Of them," she said, nodding toward the distant town. "Of the silence, of what I was before." He looked out toward the hills, toward the hollow where he had first built a fire for her. "You're not the same woman," he said. She took a deep breath, the cold air filling her lungs. "No," she whispered, "I'm not." Neither of them saw the figure watching from the tree line, a man on a tired horse, a man with gaunt cheeks and a festering wound in his pride, a man whose eyes burned with a venomous familiar rage. Beau Thatcher had come home, and this time he hadn't come alone. Standing in the shadows of the pines behind him were two other men from town, their faces grim, rifles held loosely in their hands. They weren't here for a conversation. They were here for a reckoning. The sun was a bloody smear on the horizon. It bled through the frost-covered trees, casting long, monstrous shadows across the snow. Eloise felt it first, a shift in the air, a wrongness. The cheerful song of a winter wren cut off mid-trill. The world held its breath. Then came the sound, the crack of hooves on frozen earth. Not one horse, several. Talon looked up, his body going unnaturally still. His hand didn't move toward the knife at his belt, but his whole being became a weapon, coiled and ready. Eloise turned, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. They came over the ridge. 3 riders. Bo was in the lead. He looked worse than she remembered. Thinner, dirtier. The cruel twist of his mouth was still there, but his eyes were bloodshot and haunted. He rode with the slump of a man who had lost everything and was looking for someone to blame. The 2 men with him were Jeb, the town drunk, and a farmer named Silas, a hard, humorless man who served as the preacher's right hand. Both held rifles. "Well, look who didn't die," Bo called out, his voice thick with whiskey and hate. "Too stubborn, I suppose." Eloise said nothing. She just stood there, straight and tall, the mended shawl clutched in her hands. Bo swung off his horse, staggering as he landed. His eyes flicked from Eloise to Talon, a sneer spreading across his face. "This is what you traded me for?" He spat, gesturing with his chin at Talon. "A redskin with a dull knife and no goddamn property to his name." Talon didn't move. He didn't speak. His stillness was more menacing than any threat. "You really thought I was gone for good?" Bo took a step closer, his bravado fueled by the men behind him. "Thought you could just move a savage into my house, sleep in my bed, and I wouldn't come back for what's mine." Eloise took a slow, deep breath. The old fear was there, a ghost whispering in her ear, but its voice was weak now. "You left me to die," she said, her voice as cold and clear as the winter air. Bo laughed, a bitter, ugly sound. "I gave you a chance to be a proper wife. You were the one who couldn't handle it. That's on you." It was then that Talon finally moved. He took one slow, deliberate step forward, placing himself between Eloise and Bo. His shadow fell over Bo like a shroud. "You should leave," Talon said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a landslide. Bo turned on him, puffing out his chest. "You got no say in this. This is my land. She is my wife." "No," Eloise said, her voice ringing out, sharp and final. "Not anymore." Bo's head snapped back to her, his face contorting with rage. "You're still wearing my ring!" he screamed. She held up her left hand. Her finger was bare. For a second, Bo froze. Something inside him seemed to shatter. The last of his self-delusion, the lie he'd been telling himself, cracked open, revealing the rotten core beneath. That's when he lunged. It wasn't a fight. It was an explosion of pure, clumsy rage. He pulled the knife from his belt and charged at Talon. But Talon moved like smoke. He didn't sidestep. He flowed. He met Bo's charge, his hand catching Bo's wrist in a grip of iron. There was a sickening crack of bone. The knife clattered to the frozen ground. Before Bo could even scream, Talon's other hand shot out, not as a fist, but as an open palm, striking Bo's chest with a force that lifted him off his feet. Bo landed hard on his back, the air driven from his lungs in a great whooshing gasp. It was over in 2 seconds. Jeb and Silas stood frozen, their rifles half raised, their faces slack with shock. They had come for a lynching, not a lesson in swift, brutal efficiency. Talon didn't even look at them. He stood over Bo, who was writhing on the ground, clutching his broken wrist and gasping for breath. "You going to kill me now?" Bo spat, his words mixed with blood and dirt. "No," Talon said, his voice laced with contempt. "I don't bury cowards." He kicked the knife away, sending it skittering across the ice into the trees. Bo scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of humiliation and pain. His eyes darted from Talon to Eloise, then to his so-called friends, who were already starting to back away, lowering their rifles. The fight was gone. Only the poison remained. "You're nothing," he hissed at Eloise. "You hear me? You'll always be nothing." She took a step forward, closing the distance between them. She looked down at this pathetic, broken man who had haunted her life. "I was nothing to you," she said softly. "But I am not nothing to myself, not anymore." He let out a short, sharp laugh. You think this is gonna last? This little game of house you're playing? The town will never let you be. They'll run him out and they'll burn you out. You'll see." Eloise stared at him, her eyes as calm as a frozen lake. "Let them come," she said. "I would rather be judged by my enemies for surviving than be pitied by my friends for staying." Beau stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time. Not the frightened girl he'd married, not the broken woman he'd left to die, but a queen standing on the ashes of the life he had tried to destroy. Without another word, he turned, stumbled to his horse, and hauled himself into the saddle. He gave one last hateful glare at Talon, then dug his heels into the horse's flanks and galloped away, a coward fleeing the scene of his own defeat. Jeb and Silas exchanged a nervous look, then scrambled onto their own horses and followed, leaving a trail of dust and shame behind them. Eloise didn't move until the sound of their hoofbeats had faded completely into the vast, indifferent silence of the prairie. Then, she sat down on the porch steps, the strength finally leaving her legs. Her shawl fluttered around her shoulders, like wings that had been folded for far too long. Talon walked over and sat beside her, not too close, but near enough that she could feel the solid, steady warmth of his presence. No words were needed. The battle was over. But the war, she knew, was just beginning. Later that evening, as the sky bruised into shades of lavender and bruised purple, she did something she'd been meaning to do for weeks. She found a pry bar in the barn and walked to the front of the cabin. Nailed above the door was a weathered wooden sign, the letters carved deep: Thatcher Homestead. She worked the pry bar under the edge and pulled. The rusty nails screeched in protest, but the sign came free. She carried it to the fire pit and dropped it in. Talon watched from the porch as the flames licked at the wood, curling the edges, turning the letters of her old name, his name, into black, meaningless ash. As the last piece of the sign collapsed into embers, Eloise whispered something to the wind, a final goodbye. The wind carried it away and scattered it into the darkness, as if it, too, was ready to forget. The quiet that followed Beau's departure was different. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of before. It was a clean silence, a peaceful silence. The silence of a battlefield after the victors have gone home. The cabin began to feel less like a shelter and more like a fortress. Talon reinforced the back wall. He built a small, sturdy bench beneath the west-facing window, a place to watch the sunset. Eloise planted a small herb garden in a wooden box he built for her, nurturing tiny green shoots from the stubborn soil. They were building a life, not with grand gestures, but with small, steady acts of creation. A repaired shutter, a mended blanket, a shared meal. They never spoke of love. The word was too small for what was growing between them. It was something quieter, stronger, a bond forged in ice and fire. It was respect. It was trust. It was the profound, unspoken recognition of one survivor to another. Then, a week later, the messenger came. It was a young boy from the town riding a tired-looking pinto. He looked scared to be there, his eyes darting around nervously as if he expected to be attacked. He handed Eloise a folded piece of parchment, his hand trembling. The note was from Sheriff Amos. The ink was sharp and official. Eloise, Beau Thatcher was found dead 6 miles north of here. Looks like he fell off his horse, drunk. Got his foot caught in the stirrup. The horse dragged him a ways. It wasn't pretty. The town council is arranging a burial tomorrow at sunrise. Just a pine box in the potter's field. Thought you should know. He said your name before he passed. Some foolishness about you sending a demon after him. You ain't obligated to come. Sheriff Amos. Eloise read it twice, then a third time. She set the note on the table beside a tin of tea leaves. Her hands were perfectly steady. Her heart didn't leap. It didn't plummet. It just beat. Talon stood in the doorway watching her. He had heard the boy. He knew. She looked out the window at the setting sun, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and red. "Do you think the dead can hear apologies?" she asked the empty room. Talon was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Only if they're spoken to the living." She stood up. She took her shawl from the peg. She tied her hair back in a simple, severe knot. She laced up her sturdy boots. "I want to go," she said. "Not for him. For the woman I was when he left me. She deserves a burial, too." The ride into town was cold and silent. Talon rode beside her, a watchful guardian. As they reached the edge of town, people stopped and stared. Doors closed, curtains twitched. They parted for them like the Red Sea, their whispers following them like a foul odor. Martha Copley stood near the chapel, her mouth already curled into a sneer. But Eloise didn't even glance at her. She walked straight past the whispers, past the judgment, her eyes fixed on the small, lonely hill of the potter's field. There was no crowd, just the sheriff, looking tired, and two gravediggers leaning on their shovels. A plain pine box sat beside a freshly dug hole. Beau's name had been hastily carved into the lid by someone who clearly didn't care. The letters were crooked and shallow. Eloise walked right up to the coffin. She looked down at that careless carving of the name that had once defined her entire existence. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She simply spoke, her voice clear and strong in the morning air. "I forgive you," she said. The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, he can't—" "I wasn't talking to him," she said, cutting him off. She placed her hand flat on the rough wood of the coffin. "I forgive the woman who was too afraid to leave. I forgive the woman who thought this was all she deserved. I forgive her for staying too long." Then she turned and walked away. She didn't look back. Talon was waiting with the horses. He helped her mount, his hand briefly covering hers. It was all the comfort she needed. The wind picked up on the ride back, whipping her braid across her face. Talon stopped his horse, tilting his head, sniffing the air. "Storm's coming," he said. "Let it," Eloise murmured. But as they crested the final ridge overlooking their small valley, she saw it, and her blood ran cold. Smoke. Not the friendly gray smoke from their chimney. This was a thick, black, oily plume of smoke, and it was coming from their cabin. Talon was off his horse before it had even stopped moving, his bow already in his hand, an arrow nocked. They raced down the slope, their hearts pounding in unison with the horse's hooves. The cabin came into view, and a wave of nausea hit Eloise. A window was shattered, glass littering the ground like jagged ice. The front door hung open, ripped from one of its hinges. But it wasn't on fire. The smoke was coming from the inside. They had started a fire in the middle of the floor and left it to burn itself out. They burst inside. The place was wrecked. The table was overturned. The bench Talon had built was smashed to pieces. The contents of her cupboards were strewn across the floor, her precious flour and salt ground into the dirt. And there, on the wall above the fireplace, a message had been carved deep into the wood with the tip of a knife. The letters were crude, filled with hate. Squaw lover. It wasn't a warning. It was a declaration of war. Talon stood in the center of the ruined room, his body rigid, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. His eyes were black with a cold, terrifying fury. Eloise walked slowly to the wall. She traced the ugly letters with her fingertips. "I knew it wouldn't last," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This peace. It was too good to be true." He turned to her, and his voice was low, dangerous. "Then why is it still standing?" She looked at him, confused. "What?" "The fire," he said, gesturing to the scorched circle on the floor. "They could have burned it to the ground. Why didn't they?" She looked around. The walls were still standing. The roof he had patched was still whole. The floorboards he had replaced were still firm beneath her feet. They had vandalized it. They had desecrated it. But they hadn't destroyed it. Maybe they were cowards. Or maybe, just maybe, they were afraid. Afraid of him. She stepped outside into the rising wind, staring out at the hostile, unforgiving hills. Her past had tried to bury her here. The town had tried to shame her into silence. Beau had tried to murder her. and they had all failed. Something had taken root in this place, something tougher than the winter frost, stronger than their hate. It was dignity. It was resilience. It was a stubborn refusal to be erased. "I want to stay," she said, her voice filled with a new, unshakable resolve. Talon came to stand behind her. "They will come again," he said. It wasn't a question. "Then let them find me standing," she answered. He said nothing for a long moment. The wind howled around them. Then he stepped beside her and pressed something small and cool into her palm. She looked down. It was a carving, made from cedar wood, sanded smooth. It was a hawk's wing, perfect in every detail. "For your door," he said, a symbol of vision, of power, of freedom. Tears stung her eyes, but she would not let them fall. That night, they did not mourn. They did not despair. They worked. Together. Talon repaired the window, fitting a new piece of wood where the glass had been. Eloise swept the filth from the floor. She scrubbed the hateful words from the wall until her knuckles were raw, but the wood was clean again. She boiled new broth. She lit the lantern. She set the table upright. They sat together in the restored quiet of the cabin as the storm broke outside. Rain fell in sheets, washing the world clean. Near midnight, Eloise did something she hadn't done since she was a little girl. She stepped out onto the porch, barefoot, and let the rain soak her to the skin. She lifted her face to the black sky and she laughed. A real laugh, loud and full and free. Talon stood in the doorway watching her, a ghost of a smile on his own lips. "Come in, Eloise," he said gently. "You'll catch your death." She didn't move. She just smiled at him through the curtain of rain. "You did it again." He looked confused. "Did what?" "You said my name." A look of understanding passed over his face. He hesitated for only a second. Then he spoke her name again, not as a statement, but as a promise, as a prayer, as the only word that mattered. "Eloise." She closed her eyes, and the wind, as if in agreement, whispered it back through the pines. Not wife, not widow, not the victim, just Eloise, the woman who had survived the winter, the woman who had faced down her ghosts, the woman who had chosen to stay, and she was finally, truly, home. If you believe that everyone deserves a second chance to write their own story, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe for more tales of survival and justice.